I'm Meshal Malik, and you're watching Indus Special. On the show, we often talk about reforms needed in the educational sector and how we can make education more accessible. And while these are absolutely essential conversations to have, it's also important to talk about the individuals who impart knowledge and influence young minds, the teachers. On today's show, we discuss what the role of teachers is and needs to be in the modern age. Joining us for this today is Professor Devoogd, who's a professor of neuroscience at Cornell University. He joins us from New York. Also joining us today is Ms. Sydney Jensen, who's an English teacher at Lincoln High School in Lincoln, Nebraska. She also has served as an instructional coach working with new and veteran teachers to provide instructional support and mentorship. She joins us from Lincoln. Thank you both for joining us, and a very warm welcome to the show. Ms. Jensen, let me begin with you, and I'm going to start from a different point here. Not exactly related to the curriculum, but what teachers need to do beyond the curriculum. What are some of the roles we often forget to talk about when it comes to how teacher and student dynamic needs to evolve in the classroom, which is not related to the coursework?
Sure. I think that historically teachers have been expected to be curriculum specialists, with expertise in a content area. But as we move forward, it is more and more important for teachers to also be social emotional learning specialists, helping to develop the whole child in, what we sort of call soft skills, the ability to have a conversation, the ability to empathize with other people and apologize, to learn from their mistakes. And those are some important qualities as we learn in the 21st century. We're not training students to leave school and then go work at a factory. That's not the reality of most workforces. Rather, we need our students to leave our care and be able to be critical thinkers and problem solvers and collaborators, because those are the jobs that technology and machines can't do. And so that's what we need our students to be able to do. And so as teachers, that's a big responsibility. It's not just about teaching students math and science and reading and writing. It's about teaching them communication. And with that, we have to be able to build relationships with our students and facilitate building relationships among our students.
Right. Those are all very important points, and we're going to talk about that in greater depth, how that can be achieved and the type of training that is required for teachers to be able to fit into that role. But I want to jump to Professor Devoogd and talk to him a little about the impression on young minds that happens, especially during early schooling years, primary education, when there are negative and positive experiences within the classroom. Professor Devoogd, what do we know about that? How impactful is that for learning on throughout adulthood and even later childhood years?
I think what we often forget is the extent to which children are born wanting to learn things. From the time that a baby is looking at a mother or father and trying to figure out how things work in the world. And I think that we can take advantage, the good teachers take advantage of that when children come. And children come to school when they're 4 or 5 years old, asking why, asking how, asking where. And the good teachers capitalize on that and say, here's some things that you're asking about. Here's some things that you never thought about. And so good teachers then are taking a developing brain that is looking for new knowledge, and they're simply helping it achieve that.
Professor Devoogd, I hear you using a phrase, they're good teachers, and especially in our part of the world, I can speak from our experiences, we are told to respect our teachers regardless of their dealing with us. That's just our culture, and one that, of course, instills a lot of discipline within students. But is there a need to talk critically between the difference of a good teacher and a bad teacher?
Of course, there's variation in teachers. There's variation in doctors. There's variation in anything. And of course, families should teach their children to be respectful, to live in a society in which they're not being hostile. But I think families also the family has an obligation, a responsibility toward their children, to push the teachers to be as good as possible, to find good teachers for their children.
Right, I point there. Ms. Jensen, on that similar point, how do we have this conversation about the fact that teaching isn't an easy profession and some are more suited for it than others?
One of the things that I think is really important is, for so long, teaching has been something that's mostly done in isolation. We close our door and we teach our students, and there's not a lot of oversight to that. But along with that, it also stifles some of that collaborative aspect. And so what I want to see is a bigger push to opening our doors as teachers, to observing one another teach, because that's one of those ways that we do become better. I don't think the expectation is that any teacher in their first year in the profession is going to be considered a great teacher. But it's those teachers who see that room to grow and who actively pursue that growth that are going to become great teachers. So as we create a profession that people want to stick with and stay in, that longevity often leads to improvement and good teachers turning into great teachers. And so I think that's one of the things that we have to focus on.
Right. And Ms. Sydney Jensen, you are also a coach for many teachers. You help them through that process. What are some of the things that you find are essential for teachers and individuals in that position to be aware regarding the modern dynamics we have in classrooms, how to deal with students who are more inquisitive, who have different influences coming to them, especially a large influence coming from social media?
Sure. Yeah, we're definitely working with the content generation right now. Our students have so much knowledge and information at the tips of their fingers, literally. I work in a school that's one-to-one with computers, and so every student has access to the internet and technology basically 24 hours a day. And that's a great responsibility as well. And I think it is a great challenge to teachers because it's not about sit and get lecture style teaching anymore, because a student can sit and get that information with or without their teacher standing at the front of the room. All they have to do is Google it. And so I think that has pushed teachers and challenged teachers to create more engaging, deep thinking lessons and critical thinking lessons. And that's only going to be positive for our students who are eager to learn more. Teachers get to be the vehicle and the vessel for that learning, guiding it without just being someone who is sharing facts and information at the front of the room.
Right. And Professor Devoogd, talking about various teaching styles, we know that there are certain things that are, distinctive to each teacher. They're a part of their personality. But when we talk about engagement and learning and pushing students towards critical thinking, are there certain types of teaching methodologies that you feel work better than others?
I think that a big piece of that extra part is not simply having knowledge that I, as a teacher, am trying to convey to my students, but being willing as a teacher to listen to them, to respect their insights. And I know that many places where I've worked talk about the importance of critical thinking. I think that's be careful what you wish for. I think if you want critical thinking for a student to ask questions about chemistry or about any other subject matter, you're going to get a student who also asks questions about tradition, also asks questions about family, also asks questions about the teacher. And so a teacher needs to develop a kind of enjoyment of the student going as far as the teacher knows and going even further. I have to be secure enough that in my teaching I can say, I don't know, but let's see if we can find out together. And I think that some teachers have problems with that.
Right. Professor, that's a very important question you bring up, and especially when we talk about debates on college campuses and the need to challenge what's happening, especially challenge traditions, challenge the old mode of life to try to find and strive for something better. That's all part and parcel of critical thinking. But do you feel like, as you mentioned here, that insecurity feeling college campuses, university campuses, even faculties are growing more wary of that trend of critical thinking and challenging tradition, student activism, many would say. Do you think that they're growing wary of that trend?
I don't think any more so than in my professional life. When students come into my class, I say that there are facts, there are basic aspects of knowledge that they need to have. But I say that in addition, I want them to be asking questions, not just questions about, Professor Devoogd explained that more clearly, but questions like, why is this important? How can we relate this to the rest of our lives? Why do many people think this when you're telling us that? And as a teacher, I think an important piece, and I think Sydney Jensen might be able to add to this, an important piece is not just communicating outward, but listening, watching and seeing whether the students understand, being open to questions, being open to somebody looking intrigued or somebody looking puzzled or somebody looking bored, and then being able to interact with that.
Right. Thank you so much, Prof. Devoogd, for joining us and talking to us about that. Ms. Sydney Jensen, on that point of critical thinking, now that is an interesting point that Professor Devoogd talked about, that the teacher needs to be secure enough to allow students into that space where they might even challenge certain uncomfortable topics, many topics that do not align with the teacher's own beliefs. Is that something teachers are willing to do in the modern age? Because we know open debate and dissent is necessary in order to challenge many of the things we've seen wrong in our system, and that continuously reproduce several inequalities we see.
I think absolutely. I think it should be a prerequisite for entering the profession. If you're not comfortable with students sharing their own thinking and questioning everything around them, well, that's a big vehicle to learning. There's a saying that the person doing the talking is the person doing the learning. And so if it's only the teacher who's being able to share how they're making inferences or how they're applying their knowledge to their daily life, well, then students become passive in the learning process. And so as educators, we have to become comfortable with students being more active in the learning process.
And how difficult is it for a teacher to leave those biases outside the classroom, those personal biases? We know that no form of knowledge is purely objective. We know that now. There are always subjective takes to everything we see, everything we hear. But how can a teacher move towards at least aspiring to be neutral or open-minded?
I think that comes with reflective practices. You know, you have to really reflect on what's the objective of this learning, and does it matter what my opinion is, or am I more concerned with, are my students able to communicate and articulate what they believe and evidence to support those beliefs in a way that's academic and that's ethically and morally sound by research standards. And so if we as teachers remain focused on the learning outcomes and those goals, then I think it becomes easier to set our own personal beliefs aside in favor of the learning.
Right. Ms. Simpson, stay with me. I also want to introduce another guest who's joined us, Mr. Hugh, who's a teacher trainer and has over 25 years experience in the field and is the co-founder of Lexical Lab. He joins us from London. Thank you so much, Mr. Deller, for joining us, and welcome to the show. Now, we've been talking about the need to create that space in the classroom that allows students to engage with critical thinking, and the teachers being comfortable enough with that idea that not all students are going to agree with their notions, with their ideas. Now, you have been in this profession of teaching and training. What are some of the things you feel like need to change in terms of keeping up with the trends of the modern day world?
So I think in terms of critical thinking, I think critical thinking is obviously a very important skill. But I think, as you suggested, it does imply teachers who are comfortable and students who are comfortable with ambiguity and with divergence in a way. I think one of the problems with certain kinds of approaches to critical thinking is it can become a kind of guess what the correct way of thinking about this question is. And I think that's problematic. I think if you really want students to develop critically, particularly in my field of English language teaching, there's two things. One is a kind of acceptance of and tolerance of and encouraging of diversity of opinion and different ways of seeing things. And the other one, I guess, is also thinking about how to help students have the language that they need to express those differing perspectives. And sometimes as a teacher, managing whatever conflicts or whatever disagreements may occur in the classroom as a result of people expressing different opinions. In terms of keeping up to date with modern trends, I think sometimes as a teacher that can be something which overwhelms us, because I think especially nowadays with the coronavirus crisis and the lockdown periods that many of us are experiencing. I mean, we're in week 8 of lockdown here in London. There's huge pressure on us to integrate technology in different kinds of ways. And obviously, I think it's important that we learn how to do that, that we learn basic approaches to integrating tech in the classroom. But I don't think that's what we should be driven by. I think as teachers still, in a way, we need to remember why students have been coming to classes for thousands of years, and why we still have a system of teachers and students. And I think while it's important to keep in touch with, modern pedagogical, technological orientations towards the teaching profession, it's also really important to remember the fundamentals of human relationships, human bonds, the classroom, even if it's an online classroom, as primarily a social space and a space where people can share their thoughts and ideas and feelings.
Right. Mr. Deller, as I hear you talk about this, and the passion in your voice, and I hear the passion in Ms. Jensen's voice, I'm curious to know what pushed you towards this profession. What was it that made you want to go towards the teaching profession?
Question. In my case, it was a kind of lucky accident. I'm not one of those people that ever planned to be a teacher when I was growing up. I wanted to be a musician, to be honest. I did English literature at university, and then I did a range of different, fairly badly paid menial jobs after university. And I wanted to travel and see the world. And a friend of mine one day suggested English language teaching. And I said that I didn't like most of the teachers I'd ever had very much. And he suggested that not liking teachers you'd had at high school was a good reason for becoming a teacher. And that you could regard teaching as a kind of a form of revenge against the bad teachers that you once had. And that really kind of struck a chord with me. And I think after that, teaching became quite a kind of, in a way, a political act for me, because as a teacher, what you try to do in the classroom is to create the world in the way that you think it should be. You try to create the relationships that you think should exist between people, the mutual respect that you think should exist between people. So I think I stumbled into it by accident as a result of this conversation, but what's kept me in teaching is very much a kind of passion for the groups and the dynamics and the relationships that teaching can bring into being in the world.
Right. Mr. Deller, that is such an input, and I want to pick up on that, but after we hear Ms. Jensen's experience of this as well. Ms. Jensen, was it as similar to Mr. Deller's experience that you wanted revenge from your previous teachers, or was it a particular teacher that drove you to actually entering this profession?
Sort of neither. I like Mr. Deller, I never intended to become a teacher. That wasn't necessarily my plan right out of high school. But in college during the summers, I worked at an American summer camp doing things like, canoeing and horseback riding and archery. And it was as a summer camp counselor that I really figured out that I loved learning with kids. I was no expert in any of those outdoorsy, nature-based learning skills. And so I was really learning with my campers, with my kids. And after a summer working at camp is when I changed my major in college to English education and became a high school English teacher. You know, to his point, civil discourse isn't something that's necessarily like instinctual or inherent.
Right.
It's something that has to be taught and practiced. And so a big role of school is that social aspect where students get to practice civil discourse and disagreements. And that's so important for our students to then be able to go out into the world and have conversations and disagreements with other people while remaining civil and kind and empathetic to everyone's experience and not just their own. And that's a responsibility I don't take lightly. I really enjoy those conversations with my students. I love getting to know them and their families and really being a part of our school community.
Right. And it's the point that you mentioned, civil discourse, and the point that Mr. Delder mentioned, that this teaching is a political act for him. It brings me to that notion and that idea of how do we create critical thinking minds that can deal with the challenges that are upcoming. Mr. Delder, that idea of this being a political act, we know that we need changes in the world we're living right now. Everything that we've seen happen, especially during this pandemic, has proven that. How do we engage with those difficult ideas in classrooms while we have political rhetoric going out that is happening outside the classrooms, often contradicting those thoughts?
Yeah, I think it would be foolish to pretend that it's easy. Okay. I think one of the frustrations that lots of young people have is that they feel they're quite capable of thinking critically and of seeing alternative perspectives, but they're not necessarily aware of or even able to believe in the idea that there's space in society for those ideas to come to fruition. So I think it's a kind of 2 or 3-fold process. I think as teachers, there needs to be space built into your lessons where you're able to allow students to bring their own perspectives and to discover and discuss other perspectives on pressing issues of the day. Okay. And as a teacher, not necessarily putting forward your own point of view always, or recognizing and encouraging students to recognize that your point of view is just one among many. I think on top of that, there may also sometimes be discussions that need to be had about the problematic nature of then trying to implement some of those critical solutions. Because, you know, as I said, students may often be aware of, well, we need to do more to tackle climate change, but no one listens. And when you're in that kind of situation, sometimes you also need to have a discussion about, well, how can we combat this defeatism, or how can we combat, you know, what positive steps are we capable of making, and what do we recognize is beyond our control?
Right. Ms. Sydney Jensen, on that, I want to put my last question to you. As you talked about, we need to prepare students for civil discourse in which they can engage intelligently, but also maintain what is needed to maintain in order for it to be respectful. What do you think is important, and what are the things that you impart to your students in that regard?
I really see myself as someone who has to model that behavior for them. As Mr. Delder said, as a teacher, it's not my job to put forth my own opinions, but it is my job to model proper listening techniques and acceptance and questioning of other people's ideas, so that my students can practice responding to someone who respectfully questions their own thinking, and they get that experience of practicing explaining their thought process in a research-based way. We're living in this, society of fake news, and so a big part of my job is to teach students about credibility and journalistic ethics, and so that's what I see as a big part of my role moving forward, is the responsibility that I have to be a model in a leadership position for my students, and to show them what it looks like to listen, to agree, to change my opinion. I think that's something that we struggle with in today's society, to be convinced by someone else's argument. And even little things like showing them what does it look like to genuinely apologize. And so, as teachers, ego has to sometimes go out the door for the sake of learning and modeling for our students the type of people that we hope that they'll be as a part of our society when they become adults. Right.
On that point, thank you so much, Ms. Sydney Jensen, joining us, talking to us about your experiences as a teacher and the way forward in this, and Mr. Hugh for talking to us about some of the ideas we need to keep in mind, especially teachers and also those participating in the classroom as students. We're going to go for a short break, but when we come back, we're going to have another story for you. Stay with us. Welcome back to the show. Now, every child that comes into this world deserves love, deserves care, and deserves safety. We as a global society continue to fail in giving children a world that they should deserve. With unending conflict, destruction, and generational inequality, millions of children inherit truly tragic conditions. But seldom are children made the primary targets of terrorist attacks. But yesterday, that's what happened in Kabul. A maternity ward was attacked. 16 people, including 2 babies, were killed. These babies, along with other newborns who were injured, knew what death looked like before they were able to recognize love. Mothers who should have been holding their babies lay bloody and still. The tragedy that took place can only be described as the cruelest of attacks. Let's discuss this developing story further. Thus, today is Mr. Mohammad Hadith, who's a journalist joining us from Kabul. Thank you so much, Mr. Hadith, for joining us, and welcome to the show. Under these circumstances, of course, what's happening is very, very grim situation. What more do we know about the attack that happened?
Thank you, Michelle, for having me. Let me share the latest figures. The yesterday attack, the brutal attack, the death toll raised to 24 people killed in yesterday attack, and more than 30 people wounded, according to the Ministry of Health of Afghanistan. And as you mentioned, yes, before the yesterday brutal attack in Kabul, before the children got a name, they were deprived from their mothers. And the yesterday attack was kind of very shocking attacks, and they shocked all the Afghans and even the international community. And that was Afghanistan is bleeding, and the yesterday attack in Kabul clearly remind that the Islamic State, which was responsible for the attack, is a very deadly front in Afghanistan, despite all the claims that the Afghan government was saying that they defeated ICE and their leadership has been eliminated.
Right. Of course, the world stands in solidarity with Afghanistan and all the lives that were lost yesterday. Can we talk a little more about after the attack that happened and the situation in the hospitals, especially focusing on the fact that the health infrastructure in Afghanistan has been weakened by war, and given this current pandemic, we can only imagine how grave the situation might be.
Yes, unfortunately, the yesterday brutal attack was happened in the middle of pandemic that all the world and also the Afghanistan are also facing with fighting with COVID-19, and the health system in Afghanistan has broken and already very packed with all patients. So yesterday, according to the footage which were shared in social media, the situation was very horrifying, and the people were, we were seeing the newborns, baby covered in a bloody corpse, and also the mothers, they were laying in the hospitals. And these all shows that Afghanistan is in a very brutal manner. The insurgents, they are bleeding, and it really negatively affect on the moral of the Afghans, ordinary Afghans, which is living in Afghanistan.
Mr. Hadith, can you talk about these attacks that target civilians, and especially that target children, babies, as you said, who did not even have the opportunity of living life enough to get a name? they were attacked. Is this uncommon, or throughout the years, have civilians, have children become regular targets?
Unfortunately, in the recent 2 months after signing peace deal between the Taliban in the United States and Doha, and all over Afghanistan, the violence has been increased in peak level. But the yesterday attack, it is a new phenomena attacking on the newborn babies, mothers, civilians. That is, however, not a new thing. The Afghans throughout the years, they are facing such kind of brutality from the different insurgents groups. But after signing of the peace deal between Taliban and United States, there were hopes that it comes to this peace agreement, bring Afghanistan to end the 2 decades war in Afghanistan. But it seems that throughout the trying effort by Taliban in United States, Afghanistan is still bleeding, and the people, they are really concerned about their ongoing violation, which lost every day.
Right.
The civilian people and
But Mr. Hadith, the Taliban came forth and said that they were not responsible for this attack. How is that being perceived, that statement?
Yeah, true. Yesterday, the Taliban said in a statement that they were not behind the attacks, but simply denying of the Taliban that they were not behind the attack. I mean, the Afghan people, the ordinary people, thinking that ongoing violation by the Taliban in Afghanistan kind of paved the way for other insurgents groups that they launched their offensive. And the Taliban, however, they claim that they were not behind the attacks, but it's considering the Afghan people, they are considering the ongoing violation by the Taliban paved the way for the other, like the Islamic State and the other insurgents groups, that they are continuing their brutality in killing the innocent people. Right.
As you mentioned, for reasons that are obvious, this attack is is extremely gruesome. But there is this horrific novelty attached to it, something like this happening. There is this newness attached to it, the nature of it. What do you think could have prompted an attack like this?
Yeah, true. Meshal, the Islamic State, which were behind the attacks, obviously, I mean, in the past, the Islamic State and the other insurgents groups, they were very brutally killing the innocent people, and that was the Afghan people. They were not the yesterday attacks were not the last attack, and they were expecting that more such kind of heinous attacks would be continued. But the one thing is very much the Afghan people, they're asking from the government that the government should take a very major step for stability, for fighting against these militant, and that's obviously the militant groups will continue their offensive, and that would be not the last, and they will also continue in the future as well.
Right. On that point, thank you so much, Mr. Muhammad Hadith, for joining us, taking us through what the on-ground situation looks like right now. Now we're joined by Ms. Fawzia Koofi, who's a parliamentarian, joining us from Kabul as well. Thank you so much, Ms. Koofi, for joining us, and welcome to this show. Now, President Ashraf Ghani has stated that the government will be on an offensive after this. What does that mean for the Afghan people?
You know that the war in Afghanistan has become very complex. And the complexities especially increases when the barbaric and horrific attacks happen like yesterday on civilians, women, newborn babies, which is not something that is common in our history and our culture. So, and then when the Taliban do not take the responsibility and nobody else takes the responsibility, it actually adds to the complexities of the war. And on the other hand, you have, the whole public. The public sentiment is to end this violence, to really move forward with a peace plan that is acceptable by all sides. So I think the people of Afghanistan, be it people who, the civilians, or those who actually fight from the government, the military, and those even that fight on behalf of Taliban, the Taliban soldiers, they are Afghans at the end of the day. And to lose lives every day has become a very tragic phenomenon and scenario for people of Afghanistan. So therefore, we would like to call upon the Taliban and the government of Afghanistan, and especially the Taliban that have been hesitant on fire, to really respect the situation, the people of Afghanistan, and agree on a ceasefire.
Ms. Koofi, now what do you see as being, unfortunately, we have to have this conversation, but what do you see given not just what's happening in Afghanistan, but all across the world right now, the worst case scenario when it comes to civilian lives? If hospitals get overburdened, as they are getting so all across the world, and civilian infrastructure is targeted, what is the future looking like?
We are not in a very nice moment in the world. Afghanistan has already been a country that loses lives on a daily basis. If you look at the UN, the United Nations report on civilian casualty in the first quarter of the year 2019, 2020, we were in the peak of civilian casualties. Now you add all these other challenges like the COVID-19 pandemic. I think we are tight with enormous challenges, but in the meantime, now that the negotiation team with on behalf of Islamic Republic of Afghanistan with Taliban is set up, is established, our hope is that the intra-Afghan talks will start soon. And our hope is that we, looking at what's happening globally around the world in terms of the pandemic, that the Taliban and the government of Afghanistan will actually commit themselves to a ceasefire, so that we reach out to the people who already are suffering from enormous challenges, including poverty and due to the pandemic, and also people who are affected with the pandemic, so that we could reach out to them and we could facilitate a smooth transition of this virus in our region.
Right. On that point, thank you so much, Ms. Fawzia Koofi, for joining us, taking the time to talk to us. Thank you for watching Indus Special. We will see you again next week with more stories. Till then, goodbye and take care.